Welcome back to Burn the Haystack with Josh and Jesse.
I'm Jesse.
And I'm Josh.
And this is a show all about saving the best and burning the rest.
It sure is. And today we are so lucky to have the one and only Ben Reynolds back with us today. Welcome, Ben.
Hey, good to be with you guys again.
Yeah, I think you're actually getting close to being the most recurring guest now.
Yeah. This is third or fourth time?
3?
Third. I'm leaning towards 4.
I think it could be the third.
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, Ben is with us today, and we're really excited. We're going to be talking about Jesus, which is always a good topic to talk about. It sounds so broad when I say it like that.
Technically, Josh, isn't every episode we do about Jesus?
Yes, it is, Pastor. Definitely. Well, we like to think so anyway.
Yeah.
No, but I guess what we're looking at today is the idea of the historical Jesus. And so there's lots of cool stuff to unpack there, and it's a big topic. So right now we don't exactly know where we're going to go with it. Well, we do have a bit of an idea, but yeah, we're just going to kind of navigate through it, and we're really excited. But before we get to all of that, we have to do the question of the week. Which is always a great time. So basically, Ben, we just ask a random question and all of us have to answer it.
Oh, that's right. Because last time Ben was on, we weren't doing this. This is a new development. This is a show
new feature.
Yeah, this is an evolution of our show.
But it's an easy question. It's okay. Okay, so very timely. As of today, as we're recording this, New Zealand has just moved from level 4 to level 3 in terms of our COVID-19 lockdown and defense strategy and getting on top of it. So basically with level 3, there's been some small changes. Businesses have opened again, but for like a day-to-day life, it's pretty much the same as it was in level 4, except now you can buy things. But my question is, what do you miss most about our pre-COVID-19 New Zealand? Or like, what's one thing that you really miss and that you're kind of like, oh, I can't wait to get back to that when this is all over?
Would you like to go first, Ben? Or would you like me to go first?
There's a few things, I guess. I was reading the news this morning, and apparently there were some quite significant queues at the drive-thru from McDonald's and KFC and some of these other places. And I have to be honest, I do have a hankering for some good Indian.
Ooh.
So that's something that I have missed, and maybe can indulge in some of that this week. We'll see. On a more serious note, I think just the physical presence with people, just being able to sit around a table and have a meal together, or just sit and chat, and feeling a little bit zoomed out at the moment with all the online calls. So just the physical presence is going to be something I miss and something that I'm really looking forward to experiencing again.
Yeah, that Zoom fatigue, that's real. Hey, like people everywhere. Oh, goodness. Yeah, no. I think I'm very similar. Like, there's the superficial stuff like McDonald's and all that sort of stuff. I would like to go to McDonald's at some point. Not that I went to McDonald's that much beforehand, but like, it's when you don't have something, you miss it. Like, just the option of having it is nice, but not being able to have it makes you miss it even more. I do miss going to my local coffee shop and getting a nice long black and being able to just get their beans. They roast their own beans, and I miss that. I'm having to buy pack and save beans, which some of them are okay, but I've had a few hit and miss opportunities because I'm grinding my own beans now because I use a dripper. A drip over.
I knew you were going to bring it up. I knew it. I was just waiting. I'm like, I know Jesse's going to bring up that new dripper that he bought at some stage in this podcast. I know it. I knew it. I couldn't believe it's happened within 5 minutes.
Guys, I bought a Hario V60. It's the coolest thing ever. No, it is pretty cool though. Anyway, I missed that. But that's not the real thing. That's just fluff. What I really miss behind me, if you're watching the YouTube video, you can see the board games. I miss actually being able to sit down and play a board game with my friends, being able to have 4, 5, 6 people around the table, chatting, laughing, eating unhealthy food, and playing a game. It's just, I've got all these games and I can't play them. It's really frustrating, and I really miss it. So
It would be. Yeah. Yeah, that'd be fun. I'd actually be really down to play a board game right now that I think about it. But I think for me, it's like, okay, the less serious one is like sushi, or like specifically, it's probably like donburi bowls. Oh, I miss it so much. I can't wait. But I don't know if any of those places are open where I am yet. So I don't know if they have like contactless pay and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know if they can open, but I'm gonna check this week. So I really miss that food-wise, but the biggest thing I miss, like the more serious thing, is like I'm a hugger. I really miss giving people hugs, you know? And I know as a pastor, it's all like side hugs and stuff, but still, like I just miss like physical contact, like shaking someone's hand, giving someone a high five, a fist bump, all that sort of stuff. I just miss it. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's big. I didn't realize probably how big a deal it was to me until I've had like a fast from it, really. Yeah.
It's the stuff we take for granted, hey?
Yeah. Also haircuts. I can't wait to get my haircut. I was so lucky. I got a haircut the Friday before they announced they were going into level 3, and then subsequently level 4. So I was like, whew, dodged a bullet there. Otherwise it would be absolutely like I would be overgrown.
Yeah, I missed that too.
just turn your head slightly so we can see. Yeah.
Majestic.
I will say it's actually hard to tie up at the moment. It is pretty long. I probably am due for a haircut, but
how often do you get your haircut?
Pretty much like once a year, maybe.
Okay.
Or maybe like once every 9 months. Yeah, not very frequent.
So are you due or are you not due for one?
I think I am due. Last time I got it cut, okay, I'm not going to go too far into the story, but the woman cut it way too short and I was really angry. So it's been a very long time since my last cut.
Okay.
But it has grown back pretty fast.
Okay.
But yeah, so I think I am due. I wasn't sure because it's like cut it way shorter than normal. So I wasn't sure when I'd be due next, but now it's like getting hard to manage. So I think I am due for a haircut soon. But I'm not really that concerned about it. I can see why you guys would be more concerned about haircut time, you know? I don't know.
Yeah, well, for me, when it gets longer on the sides, this is the longest I've had mine for quite a while. You can see all my grey hair. It's like, what? Where did that come from?
It's a crown of wisdom, Ben. It's a crown of wisdom.
Yeah. I've got to remind myself of that.
Okay, cool. Don't forget, guys, let us know what you miss most about the pre-COVID-19 world, I guess. What you're most looking forward to going back to. And you can let us know anywhere, social media, anything. Okay. But let's get into it. So Ben, just for those of us, those of us, not us, but those of our listeners who maybe aren't familiar with you, can you just give us a quick summary of who you are and what you do with your time?
Yeah, sure. So I serve as a pastor, church pastor here in Auckland, in East Auckland, and I'm also the chaplain of a primary school in Central Auckland. And I've been doing that for the last, this is the 7th year now. So I really enjoy doing that. It's a lot of fun, and married, and have one little toddler running around the house, which has been a lot of fun and very distracting when you're trying to do work at home at the moment under the lockdown. But yeah, we've been having a ball. So just, really awesome to spend extra time with the family at home and see our little Sarah growing so quickly and learning to speak and say new words. So
cool.
Yeah, it's a little bit about me.
Very cool. So today we're here to talk about, we mentioned at the top of the episode, the historical Jesus. So I suppose for our listeners, Ben, what is it about this particular subject that you find so compelling? And what do you hope that we're going to get out of our discussion today, just off the top?
So I think the importance of it is, first of all, understanding who Jesus is, because we'll probably get into this in more detail shortly, but sometimes we have a picture of Jesus that's more heavenly than historical, and can come detached from what actually happened in the first century. So it grounds our understanding, our picture, our view of Jesus in history, in real life, flesh and blood, historical reality. And so I'm hoping that throughout the course of our discussion, depending on where we end up, I'm hoping that at some point it'll just help to affirm, first of all, our faith in Jesus as a historical figure, someone who is real, and also just give us a clearer picture ultimately of who God is, because Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And so that the closer we can get to understanding Jesus and having a clearer, richer, deeper view of him, that ultimately gives us a clearer picture of God himself.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if this is a good place to start. Sorry, did I cut you off there, Josh?
No, it's good.
I don't know if this is a good place to start, but when I was growing up, there was definitely a part of academic scholarship, and maybe this wasn't part of when I was growing up. Maybe I was given something that was a little bit older, but I was always faced with the question of, did Jesus really exist? And that was part of my upbringing. Of course, as a fairly conservative SDA growing up, there was always the answer of yes, of course, Jesus existed. But that was always a question in my mind of, was Jesus actually a real person? And is that still the case today, as far as what you've been reading? Is that question still a valid question that we should be asking?
I'm trying to think off the top of my head some examples of any serious scholarship that still denies the existence of Jesus, but I honestly can't think of any. I think there's kind of this movement, they're called mythicists or something like that. Anyway, you can Google it and check it out. But no one seriously questions whether Jesus actually lived. Because if you do that, then you have to question basically every aspect of ancient history.
Okay.
Because there's more evidence that Jesus existed than for a lot of other stuff that we just take for granted, through Greco-Roman history.
Mm.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask that question right at the top of the episode, because I know that maybe that's a question that some people still have.
Yeah.
Because maybe that's a leftover from a bygone era of historical academia. Yeah, continue. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's a good question to ask, and maybe some people do still wonder that. But I think once you start digging into the evidence, I mean, there are some very simple things. If you just think about the impact of Jesus and Christianity on history, every time you write the date, you're acknowledging that it's been 2020 years since some significant event in history happened. Certainly that's the case for us in the Western world. And the impact on literature and music and so many other things. So you can't deny that just didn't come out of thin air, right? That had to be grounded in some historical reality of some sort. Now, people can debate over whether Jesus, was divine in any sense. You can debate about whether he did miracles and that kind of thing. But yeah, as I say, you can't. You have to do business with the source of the Christian movement and basically the foundation of a lot of what we experience in the West. Yeah.
So where would you say is like the best place to start in, or one of the best places to start in unpacking the historical Jesus then?
Let's look at basically the framework in which the discussion is normally taking place. So it falls into this thing called Lessing's ditch, and is based on this 18th century philosopher, Gotthard Lessing, where there was kind of this separation between historical fact and matters of faith. So Lessing's ditch. So there's this separation that exists between what we can historically verify and what people believe by faith, that can't be proven, that kind of thing. And so that kind of set the divide, and a lot of that was fueled by the Enlightenment advancements and the other philosophical movements that were happening during the 17th, 18th centuries. And so you kind of have this split between the Christ of faith and the Jesus of history. So is there a connection between those, or are they two separate things? And it's a very important question to ask, because as I mentioned earlier, over time, the church has, accumulated a lot of tradition and a lot of different understandings of Jesus, which it can be somewhat detached from history, because it's something that goes on in our belief system, and that kind of thing. So yeah, that's probably the best place to start in terms of the conversation, because it's like, well, what connection is there? Any connection? So most liberal scholarship says that there's a complete separation. So we have the Jesus of history. He didn't perform miracles. Half of what he's claimed to have said, he didn't say, and they have their criteria and skepticism for that. And then you have more conservative scholars that say, no, actually, there needs to be a connection between these two. There has to be. The Jesus of faith, again, as mentioned, is not something that came out of thin air. So it has to be grounded in some historical reality. But to what extent is that the case? So it's the history's got to inform the faith. So you've got the Christ of faith and the Jesus of history. How do we reconcile these two things?
That's interesting, because I know growing up, the Jesus that I was introduced to in church was much more of a philosophical, spiritual figure, which maybe, I don't know, maybe Jesus was more of an amalgamation of his teachings and the theology and doctrine than an actual person. And I didn't realize that until now, that the Jesus that I was introduced to very early on was more of a symbol, more of an idea, even though he was portrayed as a person. He was more of a person that was represented by symbolism and doctrine than an actual person. Isn't that interesting?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't remember who it was, but some historian has said that, again, for many people, their view of Jesus is that, when he was here on earth during his earthly ministry, his feet were like, hovering above the ground, like there was still this kind of disconnect, because Jesus is perfect and holy and sinless and all of that. So he didn't get his hands dirty or his feet dirty, in the reality of human experience. So, yeah, and so this is one of the important things for Christians when it comes to historical Jesus studies. We shouldn't just shun that and say, "Oh, that's skeptical scholarship." That there are some very important questions that are raised that come out of that. Because is Jesus someone that we can really relate to? Is he someone that really did experience what we experience, or is he, like Jesse said, just some symbol or abstract or spiritual being that's somewhat disconnected? What we experience.
Yeah, I actually remember at college, somebody, I don't know, we were in some like group Bible study in the boys' dorms or something, and one guy was like, "Man, can you imagine like actually seeing Jesus? He would have just looked so beautiful and radiant and all that kind of stuff." I'm like, I'm pretty sure the idea was that he just looked like everybody else, And the guy really struggled. He's like, "What? What do you mean? No, this is like Jesus." Like, it was really hard for him to wrap his head around that. So I think, yeah, there is an interesting distinction, and I guess that ditch we have to cross there, and that's super interesting.
Because another thing is, when we grow up, those of us who have grown up in the church, we do have a particular image of Jesus, which is more informed by the paintings, or if we come from the Catholic tradition, the statues that we see of Jesus and the iconography and that kind of thing.
Yeah, the blonde hair, blue-eyed Jesus.
Precisely. And it's like, well, Jesus wasn't, an Aryan, some 20th century European person. He was very much Jewish, which has been part of what's known as the quest for the historical Jesus that went through several movements. Yeah. certainly in our tradition, the Adventist tradition, a lot of our views growing up have been informed by Uncle Arthur's bedtime stories. That's the picture of Jesus that we have. Is there truth to that? I think so, but is it grounded in historical reality? That's what we want to make sure it is.
So, Ben, where would you suggest that we start when starting to unpack Jesus as a person in his setting, within the context of the first century Jewish world? Where would you suggest people start when talking about him as a person?
I think we've got to start with the evidence that we have. So not our preconceived ideas about who he is, not the gentle Jesus, meek and mild, or the pictures or paintings or whatever. We've got to look at the evidence that we have. And fortunately, when it comes to Jesus, we've got so much evidence. It's some historians refer to it as an embarrassment of riches, because we just have so much to deal with. When it comes to a lot of other historical figures, historical events, whether it's things like the Persian Wars or Alexander the Great, or a lot of that other stuff. Sometimes we're depending on a single source that was written decades, sometimes centuries after the fact. And so when it comes to Jesus, and we can go into this later if you want to, we have a lot of very, very early evidence and record of what Jesus did and said. So we start with the Gospels. It's the best place to start. We have 4 accounts of Jesus. We also have Paul and his letters, and Paul was actually writing before the Gospels were written down. There was oral tradition before the Gospels were actually, the oral tradition was put into writing for us. So there's Paul. There's the other early Christian writers as well. You've got James, you've got Jude, you've got the book of Revelation, etc. So we have all of that evidence. And then if people want to be skeptical about the Bible, because a lot of people are, for some reason they want to hold the Bible to a different standard to every other historical source. So if they prefer something else, you've got Josephus, who makes a couple of references to Jesus. You have Tacitus, who talks about the persecution of Christians under Nero. You've got Suetonius, you've got Pliny, you've got all these other sources. And so you got to start there with the evidence. So what do these actually tell us about who Jesus was, what he did, what he said, and so forth. So that's where you've got to start.
So the ones outside of the Bible, like Josephus, are they all just ancient? I know Josephus was a Jewish historian. Are they all just historians? Is that so that would people just be reading a bit of, extra biblical history if they're to check those out?
Yeah, and a lot of it you can just find online. There's dozens and dozens of websites. And of course, you've got the skeptical scholars who question the references to Christianity or to Jesus, but, that's, I guess, kind of to be expected. But the fact of the matter is that, very, very early on, we have these sources in the New Testament itself, and then other contemporaneous sources that are mentioning this figure called Jesus. And interestingly, even these extra biblical sources, they don't doubt the fact, they don't deny the fact that Jesus was a miracle worker. He was a healer. Which is interesting. So, they were less skeptical back then than we are today. They're like, okay, we admit the fact that, that there are these traveling preachers and healers, and strange stuff does happen from time to time. So there's never any denial of that, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, it's often quite difficult for us as modern people to imagine a world where it's generally accepted that miracles or magic or just at the very least supernatural events this is just part of our world, right? Like I find that very difficult, even having spoken to people from different parts of the world that have experienced what could only be described as supernatural experiences. It's very difficult for me to get my head around anything that isn't material, concrete, and easily explained by the laws of science. Even as a Christian, I can imagine that for somebody who doesn't have as strong a faith, or perhaps doesn't have any faith, would find that even more difficult, especially when you're reading the miracles of Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's probably one of the major reasons why people doubt Jesus and why they're skeptical about Jesus. Certainly, again, because we're talking in a Western context, because we're really the odd ones out. If you look at any other culture, both ancient and modern, they accept the fact that there's a supernatural. They have no problem with that. This whole idea of atheism and the split universe between natural and supernatural is a modern thing. It's only been around the last 300 years in the West. But that's probably the one major objection that people have to accepting the historical reality of Jesus and what the Gospels claim is this idea of miracles. But again, it comes back to your worldview. So a lot of the skepticism traces its origin back to a philosopher, David Hume, who was writing in the 18th century. And his premise that many people have bought into is basically, we don't believe these things happen because we just know from modern experience that these things don't happen. So it's a very circular kind of argument, but you're basically assessing the rest of the world on the basis of your own experience. So I've never experienced miracles, so therefore miracles can't really happen. And that, for whatever reason, that's just really caught on, and a lot of people just take that for granted. But again, we're kind of odd in the West, because if you go to other countries and talk to other people, they experience miracles all the time, like you mentioned before, Jesse. That the supernatural is something that's very much a part of their experience. And so I guess the lesson for us is not to make our experience universal, because it's silly as like, maybe one of our brothers from the Pacifics saying, I don't believe in snow because I've never seen snow. You could multiply that out. I don't believe that Paris exists because I've never been to Paris, or whatever. It's quite a ludicrous claim to be able to make that, to judge everyone else's experience on the basis of your own.
It's like those. I was going to say, it's like that group of people who I think they coincide with flat earthers a bit, but they don't believe Australia is a real place. They think Australians are all paid actors, and it's all just a big hoax. So yeah, I don't know. That's just because to them it seems like such a strange land, and they're like, "Have you ever actually met an Australian?" No, I bet you haven't. So it can't be a real place. I'm like, that's the worst logic I've ever heard in my life.
I do find it interesting that, as you said, we don't think about miracles in the sense of, well, I've never seen water being turned into wine, or I've never seen somebody's bones miraculously heal after they've been fractured in an accident. And yet it's funny, because there are things that happen in our day-to-day lives that maybe, if we were to think about them logically, do seem quite mundane, like winning the lottery, or getting that promotion at work, or having the stars align perfectly on a date, or something like that. And we would say, oh, that's a miracle, or, something quite mundane. So it's like, in some ways, we're double dipping. We deny physical miracles, or like the quote unquote outlandish miracles that we see in the Gospels. And yet I think we still experience and acknowledge miracles in our own Western sort of way, even today.
But it's just not God behind it.
Yeah, it's the universe, or it's chance.
Yeah, it's the stars, or it's some other thing. But you're right. There is and maybe we'll get into this in another podcast, but there is this very confused way that a lot of people look at the West. So they'll deny the supernatural when it comes to Jesus and stuff like that, but then they'll go and read their horoscopes every day and other stuff like that, and they'll get right into Harry Potter and all this other stuff, and it's like, well, so there is a little bit of a contradiction going on there, but yeah, when it comes to miracles, there is so much evidence to support it. We may not be able to prove it scientifically, because science proves or demonstrates what can be repeated. But history records what can't necessarily be repeated. And so we've got to make that clear distinction in our minds between what science is able to tell us and what history, in terms of documenting stuff that happened, whether or not it fits within our worldview or not. There's a book, if your listeners are interested, it's quite a massive book, 1,200 pages. He really needs to stop writing books that big. He's a New Testament scholar and historian by the name of Craig Keener. And like, the guy's never written anything less than 500 pages. But if he condenses, you can probably watch maybe a couple of his lectures for free on YouTube, where he kind of condenses a lot of the material. But he was working on this massive commentary on the book of Acts, and he got to some of the miracles in the early part of Acts, and he started creating this footnote. And the footnote just grew and grew and grew, because he was trying to document different things to support some of these miraculous claims, like, here's a similar thing that happened in Africa on this date, and here's something that happened here, etc. And I think he said when his footnote got to like 150 pages, he decided to turn it into its own book. And so he did, and then it's turned into 1,200 pages.
Wow.
So the first part of the book, he unpacks and critiques this philosophical construct that goes back to David Hume and others, this real skepticism towards miracles. And then the bulk of the book is just documented example after example after example of miracles happening all over the world, which many of which are very similar to the Gospels. Even, people being raised from the dead, miraculous healings of terminal illnesses and stuff like that. So
wow.
Yeah, I was listening to something recently, and I can't source what it was, but I found the point interesting that they were saying that no matter what your worldview is, whether you're atheist, agnostic, or you have to, or Christian, you have to have like somewhere to put the fact that like there is many documented cases all around the world, from America right through to Africa, everywhere, of people being under some sort of attack, or like having some sort of mental convulsion or something like that, but we would say it's under like demonic oppression, under that, and that the only thing that stops it is saying the name of Jesus. That's, you have to fit that into your worldview somewhere, whether you don't believe in Jesus or not. If you think that's all just psychology, that's fine, but you have to have a place for it. And I think when people actually come to terms with the sort of evidence there is of documented miracles even today, it does become difficult to, I don't know, fit it all into your worldview, I think. For somebody who's desperately trying to say that God isn't real and doesn't do anything. I'm like, okay, well, you can believe that if you want, but where are you going to put this stuff? Like, how's it going to work for you? Is it all psychology? Because it's pretty incredible if it is. I don't know. Yeah, that's my take on it anyway.
It doesn't fit very neatly into a secular worldview, that's for sure. And it is a worldview, because if you already have this presupposition that miracles don't happen, and the miracles like what we see in the Gospels were just part of some primitive, gullible, ignorant culture, then you're not going to be able to have any space in your worldview to accept modern miracles when they happen. You'll just be trying to explain it, medically or scientifically or whatever. But the point remains the same, that we can't use our personal experience to judge everyone else's experience. We can't make ours universal. We have to be open to the possibility that some weird stuff happens. And so the question then arises is, well, how do we fit that into our worldview? How do we make sense of these miracles and things like that?
Yeah.
Awesome. So that's the big thing, I think, for a lot of people when it comes to reading the Gospels historically.
Even as a Christian, I must admit that I found it quite difficult sometimes just wrapping my head around the way these things happen. And I think in some ways what I've done, and perhaps what a lot of people done, is we've compartmentalized that our experience. So like, we live in this modern advanced era, but Jesus lived in this ancient magic voodoo ooga booga era where miracles were real and everything happened, but then suddenly, they don't really happen anymore. Because as you say, it's all contextualized within my experience. I could look at Jesus's miracles and go, well, I haven't seen, somebody miraculously feeding 5,000 people from a couple of loaves of bread and 2 fish, But then I have to think of the times in my life where I actually have put God to the test, or something has happened outside of my control. Like, I remember once when I was entering Avondale, I had to, I had to sit a test, and I had to get over a certain percentage to be able to get into Avondale, and I had a specific number in my head, and I told God, I want to get this specific number on my test to. I was kind of putting out a fleece, which I know is not a good idea, generally speaking, but I was young and I was dumb, and I thought, you know what, I want to test God. And so I did. I put out a fleece and I said, hey, God, if you give me this specific number on my test out of 100, so it's 1 to 100, and I think it was like a 72. I can't even remember what the number was. It wasn't that impressive. And God actually, I believe, gave me that number when I got my test back. I remember somebody called me. I was in the middle of driving to Canberra, and I had to pull over, and they told me what score I'd gotten, and I was just blown away. And I was like, well, I guess I'm going to Avondale then. And I know a lot of people could listen to that and go, oh yeah, well, it sounds a bit contrived. It sounds a little bit like coincidental. Like, sure, that's just a really big coincidence. But at the same time, it's like, well, I don't know. There's no way to verify that, but that's my personal experience. So who am I to judge somebody else's experience from a different culture, from a different time, and the way that God worked in their lives? I don't know.
That's an important point, because if we have in our worldview an openness to miracles taking place, then we'll see them every day. Like you mentioned, the mundane things of life that we just take for granted, well, some of those I think are miracles, because it doesn't necessarily have to be this way. So once that's part of your worldview, all of a sudden you begin to see things differently. And you can say, well, if you believe in God, you can say, well, God, thank you so much for this miracle today. Even if it's something as simple as just waking up with good health in the morning. It's a miracle. When you think of all of the odds that are against us, especially with coronavirus at the moment, it's like, well, that's not such a silly thing to take for granted anymore. So miracles can happen all the time, even in the smallest of ways. We just always want to, look out for the big ones.
Yeah.
Something that defy the laws of gravity or whatever. But you're not going to believe that anyway if you're not open to the smaller ones.
That's true. That's
interesting. True. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back right after this.
I know one of the criticisms that I've heard of the accounts of Jesus's life, and especially some of the more extraordinary supernatural elements, is the whole mythologization, mythologize. I don't even know. That's probably the wrong. Is there like a proper word for that? I don't know. But the whole turning of Jesus's story into a myth, a supernatural sort of turning him into this figure. I know that for those of us who have looked into historical myths like King Arthur, for instance, there was obviously some sort of historical precedent for that story in some way, shape, or form. But the story grew through campfire. Somebody told the story around a campfire, and somebody else took that story and embellished a little bit or changed a few elements. And one of the things that I've heard is that people have done the same with Jesus's story. So when we read those first-hand eyewitness accounts and those second-hand, maybe third-hand accounts through the epistles and through the Gospels, is there an element of turning it into a myth through embellishment or changing of details? Is that a thing?
Yeah. Or you could say, it turned into a legend. Legends about Jesus. There was a real person called Jesus, but there was a whole lot of legend that grew up after him. In the telling and retelling. It's an important question to consider, and there's a lot of things to go into on that, because you're looking at anthropology and sociology. So the way that they told these stories, the contexts, who the storytellers were. There's the whole idea of memory, the part that plays in it. So yeah, when it comes to memory and the retelling of the stories, that there has been some debate about the extent of what we might call the modern accuracy that we apply, because we have modern critical standards that then we apply to ancient texts, and I don't think that's always a fair way to do that. We've got to understand the text and read them as they were in the first century or whenever they were written. So when it comes to the storytelling, some of the research that's been done on oral cultures has supported the fact that the tellings and retellings of these stories retain a general sense of accuracy over time, especially if you're doing it in community. Because if you're sitting around a campfire and you normally have kind of designated storyteller, maybe he's the patriarch of the family or the matriarch or whatever, and they will tell a story. Now, obviously, they're going to adapt the story and change it slightly depending on the audience and the time of the year and all that kind of thing. And you would expect that in an oral culture. But that doesn't detract from the events that are being recounted. And so if someone is telling the story and they get it wrong, or they mess up a certain part of the story, you've got a whole community that acts as kind of the safeguard, and someone's going to put their hand up and say, no, that's not true, this is actually the way that it happened. So there was a collective sense of accountability among some of these oral cultures. So while it didn't retain the degree of accuracy that we expect today in our written cultures, it still retained a general sense overall of the events that they were telling.
Right, because the communities were smaller, so it's a little bit hard for a lie to get around because Yeah,
and so coming to the point of lies and legends and all of that, there are several things to consider when it comes to the Gospels. The first is that the culture in the first century Jewish culture was completely averse to any kind of legends, because that was what the pagans did, right? They had the Torah, they had the prophets and the Psalms, and that was their body of authoritative work. So it was those silly pagans that told all those stories about, what the gods were doing on Mount Olympus and all the rest of it. The first century context in which Jesus lived and which Christianity began was completely averse to anything like this. Because normally when legends spring up, they are supporting or they're reinforcing the traditional values of the culture. And so they're supporting the long-held beliefs. But then you have Jesus, who claims to be God himself, which completely flies in the face of everything that a monotheistic religion believed in. There's only one God, and he doesn't become a human being. Whereas here, Jesus is claiming exactly that. And so you have what's called in historical studies the criteria of dissimilarity. So this is so different that it couldn't have just been made up out of thin air. Somebody had to have been making these claims because they're so countercultural to everything that was going on. You just can't make this stuff up. You've got the element of time as well. So it takes time for legends to develop. So you've got legends about Alexander the Great, you've got legends about Buddha, etc. But they took decades, even centuries, to develop. Whereas here you've got these gospel accounts, and we can get into the dating in a moment if you want, that were written within just a few short decades of when these events took place. And you've still got the contemporaries alive. They're saying, this happened under Pilate. Well, everyone knew who Pilate was. That this happened under King Herod. This happened under Caiaphas, the high priest. You've also got Jesus' family members, his mother, his brothers who are still alive, and they're believing this. Right? If you've got siblings, you're not just going to side with your sibling naturally, your brother or sister, because there's always competition there. And so you've got these contemporaries living at the time, and there are a lot of different Bible verses that kind of allude to the fact. One of my favorites, I've just pulled it up now, is Mark 15:21. This is towards the end of Mark's gospel. It says, a certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. So they're saying that here's this guy, Simon of Cyrene, who carried the cross, and he's the father of Alexander and Rufus.
Of course.
Which is a really exciting verse, because it's saying that the community to whom Mark was writing, they obviously knew who these fellas were, these two brothers, right? It was their dad was the one who carried the cross. So if they were going to try and make up a legend about Jesus, well, it would be completely, contradicted by all of these other contemporaries, all the way up in government down to people who lived in the different communities and in first century Palestine.
One thing that I'm trying to work through in my head right now is, so there's an assumed knowledge about many of the things, especially in the New Testament, especially in the Gospels and the Epistles. There's assumed knowledge of, we know who these people are, we know the cultural circumstances, the political, the authoritative position of some of these important figures, or what's going on in the region right now. So how do we, as 21st readers who don't have that cultural knowledge, how do we read these passages to try and derive meaning out of them, whilst having no idea who Alexander and Rufus are? Like, who are these guys? Like, what's the point of this detail?
We're so blessed to live in the time that we do, because we have so much historical material at our fingertips. We have, people that have dedicated their entire lives to studying this stuff, and so you can Google it. You can buy a good commentary. You can buy a good study Bible, which is a great place to start when it comes to explaining some of the traditions and cultural values and things that were going on in the culture at that time that help us to make sense of some of this stuff. So we've got a wealth of material at our fingertips that we can go to that help us to make sense of more of this stuff, and draw our attention to stuff that we kind of just glossed over if we're reading it and don't have an appreciation of the historical background. And that's the thing, when you understand a little bit of history, which anyone can, you don't have to be a theologian. As I say, you've got the resources. It just makes the text come alive. It comes up in 3 dimensions. It's like, these were real people struggling with real issues, the issues that we also struggle with today in many respects.
Yeah, it's easy to make the Bible feel like it wasn't written, like it was written to some mythical group of people, like, I don't know, but they're just like us, really. I mean, in a lot of ways, we're very different, but at the same time, these are the same kind of people we are. Like, we haven't changed that much, I mean, we have more technology and, we live in a pretty different world, but we're still the same kind of people, which I think, it's so true. We forget that so much when we read the Bible.
Yeah, and you look at the disciples, they're probably some of my favorite characters in the New Testament, because they just didn't get it. Over and over and over again. And it's like, some of these guys were the ones that wrote the Gospels and other, made other contributions to the New Testament. It's like, why would they portray themselves as such buffheads? They just didn't get it. Well, it's because they're writing sober history, and they're okay with that. They're like, this is how we once were. We just didn't get it. Jesus told us over and over and over again that this was going to happen and this was how things were going to be. But it wasn't until after the fact that we finally got it.
Isn't that interesting? If you're writing a spiritual text or a religious text, most people would not write themselves as being inept or stupid or making mistakes, right? That doesn't seem like a thing that you would do if you have an agenda of trying to push a religious doctrine or dogma. Hey, I think is it Daniel? Daniel is like noteworthy in biblical scholarship because he's like one of the only biblical characters that is actually written without any flaws, or am I thinking of a different character? Can't remember now.
Some people have claimed that about Daniel, but it helped because he was a eunuch.
There's less for him to get into trouble with.
Yeah, well, he was working in the king's court, and I don't know what else he had to do but study and govern.
Yeah.
So share with us a little bit around the dating of the Gospels, because I mean, normally I would just tell people to Google it, but there are a lot of different, I guess, theories on when different parts of the Bible was written, and I think in the internet age, it is a little bit hard to distinguish what the majority of scholars are actually saying about the dating of a whole lot of scripture. But I guess specifically, we'll just dive into the Gospels for the moment.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it's a huge topic as well, but there is a general consensus, I think, among scholars. You know, there might be a difference of like 2 decades,
right. Yeah.
you know, but between liberal scholars and conservative scholars, so it's not a major difference. I think there's pretty much a general consensus now that all the gospel accounts are written within the 1st century.
Cool.
So you have Mark, which is considered to be the earliest gospel. Maybe that was written around in the 50s or 60s. And then you have the Gospel of John, which was written, most think, in the 90s.
Okay. So it's not a difference of was John written 323 AD? Like that's not part of the conversation.
There were some German theologians in the 18th and 19th century that espouse the view that because his gospel account is just so different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which we refer to as the synoptics because they're so similar, they thought, well, John's gospel must have been written in the 2nd century or sometime later. But there was a piece, and this is kind of getting into another topic, but it's one I'm passionate about, textual criticism and paleography. But there was a papyrus fragment, called P52, which was discovered in the John Rylands Library in Manchester. And this fragment is part of John 18. It's about the size of a credit card, and that's been dated by many, even liberal scholars agree with this, that this fragment is the earliest copy of any New Testament book that we have, and it's dated, some say maybe around 125, and as late as 150 AD.
Wow.
And so therefore, you know, all of that German scholarship in the 19th century was saying, oh, John's gospel was written so much later, basically, you know, had to go on the rubbish dump, because this one piece of fragment it was evidence of the fact that John's gospel had to have been written, you know, by the end of the 1st century in order for this to have been a copy that made it all the way to Egypt.
And so for people thinking, well, you said as late as 150, didn't you say that, you know, John may have been written in the 90s? Like, there's no hope of ever having an original document. Like we just assume that there must be an original copy somewhere floating around, but that's something that we just should rule out completely.
Yeah, there's no chance, and it begs the question: well, what was the original? Because there were copies of copies made. Paul, we know, probably had 2 copies of every letter, and then there were other letters that were copied again and again that were circulated among the other churches. But the point of the matter here is, with this John fragment P52, is that you know, there had already been a copy, maybe a copy of a copy of a copy, that had made it to Egypt, where we think this was discovered later on in a place called Oxyrhynchus. So the Gospels were well and truly written within the 1st century.
One thing that I found surprising when I took my New Testament studies classes at Avondale was the Gospels are actually not the most early written accounts of the early Christian movement. Is it the letter to the First Corinthians church? Was that the earliest that they're thinking, or is it something else?
Paul wrote his letters earlier. He was writing as early as the late 40s. So this is, 10, 15 years. It's very, very close to the time of Jesus. And there's debate about whether Galatians was Paul's first letter. Obviously, he wrote other ones, but the ones that we still have today that survive, either Galatians or First Thessalonians.
Okay.
There's a bit of debate about which one was the earliest, but probably in the late 40s through 50s that he was writing. So those are the earliest sources we have of Jesus and the beginning of Christianity.
what do those sources tell us about Jesus and the early Christian movement? Like, not everything, but what can we know from some of those sources about Jesus and about, the way that the early Christian movement formed?
So much. Paul is already talking about Jesus being seated at the right hand of God in majesty. So there's already these very clear divine claims for Jesus just within a few short years since he ascended. So we know that Jesus was divine. Paul waxes eloquent in most of his letters about the importance of Jesus' death and resurrection, and so how we can be justified through his death. So Paul's the first theologian. He's trying to make sense because he's been brought up a Jew. He was part of the school of the Pharisees, so he knew the Old Testament thoroughly. And now he's trying to reconcile, well, how does Jesus fit within this belief system? Because Christianity, as far as he was concerned, was not a new religion. It was just the fulfillment of the promise that God made to Abraham. And so you often see him doing that in his letters, always going back to Genesis 15, the covenant that God made with Abraham, trying to work out, well, how does this look for us today? How did Jesus fulfill that? Yeah, so it teaches us a lot that Jesus' death was for the forgiveness of sins. He talks about how Jesus' death overcame the powers of darkness, the principalities and powers, and now we're involved in that spiritual warfare. That's big, particularly in Colossians and Ephesians. And then, of course, a lot of ethics. How then should we live? And so Paul spends a lot of time talking about that, the way that we're to live as people of truth, people of integrity, and most of all, people who are characterized by the three virtues of faith, hope, and love.
So all this time, so you have the apostles and the evangelists, they're going throughout Asia Minor and parts of the Mediterranean Rim and all that sort of thing. And they're telling people about Jesus and salvation, and they're telling people about the Jesus way and all that sort of thing. And we don't have until the later decades the actual recording of Jesus's life. How would people have known in the first century about Jesus's life, his miracles, his teachings? How would those have been communicated for them to not have felt like they needed to write them down like right away?
Really good question. Paul's what we know from Paul's letters is right at the end he will normally send his greetings to particular home churches that are meeting in a region, whether it's in the city of Rome, whether it's in the region of Galatia, etc. And so what we can piece together there historically is Paul would write these letters, he would dispatch them, and then someone would get up and they would read those letters to the people, because there was probably only a 10% literacy rate in the ancient world. And so very few people who actually had the ability to read. So that's how it would happen there. I think that with the stories of Jesus, and this is where some critical scholars come in and they say, look, as soon as the message of Jesus went out across the Mediterranean, people will have changed the story, and how could they control that, etc. And maybe part of that was what led to the need for the Gospels to be written down in a more permanent way like that. And we even know with copies of the Gospels, because of all the ancient manuscripts that we've discovered, the bulk of them are the Gospels, the four Gospels. They outnumber the rest by quite a bit. So we know that these Gospels were circulated far and wide in quite a short period of time as well, which would have helped to keep in check some of the things that later became heresies into the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, things like Gnosticism and
So you would have had the story of Jesus being told, and you would have had eyewitnesses in some churches perhaps, or like friends or family of eyewitnesses being able to actually verify, no, this is actually how it happened. I was there, or my brother was there, or my uncle was there, and there would have been that going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in addition to Paul's letters and the gospel accounts, you had the apostles who went out to evangelize across the world as well. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul talks about after Jesus' resurrection, he appeared to the disciples, he appeared to Peter, and then he says he appeared to 500 others. So it's quite a few people.
Yeah. Who were they?
Who could have? Yeah, exactly. Good question. Wouldn't we like to know? But they obviously spread out around the place. You have the people who came to Jerusalem who were there for Pentecost, which is described in Acts 2. So they hear the Gospels. They've heard about all this stuff about Jesus going on. And of course, many of the Jews traveled to Jerusalem for the festivals at least once a year. And if you read the Gospels, we know that Jesus created quite a stir. Certainly on one of those, when he went in the temple and did his thing, cracked the whip, and so people knew about this stuff. And yeah, there were plenty of eyewitnesses too that people could check in on. Who lived through that period, who would have been able to correct, who would have been able to provide additional insight into the life of Jesus.
Interesting.
So anyway, bottom line is that there is so much evidence that there is so much that we can go to that we can be fairly sure. Certainty, 100% certainty is impossible when it comes to just about anything, but we can be fairly sure enough to stake our life on.
Yeah. Wow. Which so many did stake their lives on this, and
yeah,
to me alone, like the early Christian martyrs is a huge. You wouldn't go through all of that for a hoax, I don't think anyway.
No.
Yeah. So, well, this has been really cool. I've really enjoyed this. I guess one thing I'd like to sort of end on is there is so much we can learn about this historical Jesus, undoing some of the myths and getting to actually who he was and what he was here for and the context in which Jesus arrived into. And it's too much to even, I mean, we were just talking in the break that we could actually have a whole podcast just devoted to this, and who knows, maybe in the future it could be fun. But for now, what are some good tools or resources or, maybe just books that you would recommend, Ben, on uncovering the historical Jesus? And yeah, just learning more about the context in which he arrived in and all that kind of thing.
Yeah. So there's a heap of material. There's The Jesus Quest by Ben Witherington. There's quite a lot of stuff in there. So he documents the different conclusions that people have come to, different historians, as they've tried to piece all the evidence together. There's another book by Helen Bond called Jesus, A Very Brief History, just a short book, probably a good primer, good introduction to Jesus studies. There's, as we've mentioned before, there's stuff online that you don't trust everything, of course. Yes. But check out Wikipedia. Wikipedia used to have a bad reputation, but because so many people can critique it and edit it, it actually ends up, all the idiosyncrasies get ironed out, and so it can be quite a good source, especially for an introduction. Just to get a big overview.
Just like the Wikipedia page on Jesus? Is that like the one
just type in historical Jesus. That will give you a good intro if you're looking at the different conclusions that people have come to in the studies. But most importantly of all, just read the Gospels, read the New Testament, go to the primary sources, check those out, just read them with an open mind. If you're a believer, invite the Holy Spirit to speak to you, because the same Holy Spirit who we believe inspired the writing of the Gospels is the same Holy Spirit that can give us wisdom and insight as we read them. But yeah, always to remember that the Jesus that we worship and that we serve was a historical figure. He was real flesh and blood. But he's not just someone who's confined to the past. He's someone who we believe died and rose again and is alive today, who we can have a living relationship with.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Awesome. Love that. Yeah, great note to finish on there. So good. Jesse, did you want to have anything you wanted to add there?
No, I think that is a beautiful place to finish it. Thank you so much, Ben. This has been an awesome conversation.
Yeah, been a pleasure, guys. Fun to hang out with you again.
Yeah, always a pleasure to have Ben on. Awesome. Hey, well, we would love to hear your thoughts, guys, on the stuff we talked about today. Just, I don't know, maybe this gave you some new insights into this idea of the historical Jesus, and we'd love to hear about it. So make sure you get in contact with us. The best place to find all things Burn the Haystack is, of course, burnthehaystack.org. You find links to all our social media and even a contact form so you can get in contact with us directly.
And if this is the first time you listening to Burn the Haystack, welcome. Please subscribe if you haven't already. And if you'd like to help us to get more reach and get out there and get more listeners, the best way you can do that is by leaving us a rating or a review on the podcatching app of your choice.
I like welcoming people to the podcast at the end of the podcast, Jesse. Very cool.
Yeah, maybe we should do that at the beginning instead. That sounds more logical.
Awesome. All right, well, thanks so much for listening, everyone. We love you. Stay awesome. That is Josh, Jesse, and Ben out.